After the slaughter of the First World War, in which approximately 12 million people were killed and a further 23 million were wounded, virtually all of whom were men of course, the British Parliament finally granted universal male suffrage in the Representation of the People Act 1918. This act gave the vote to virtually all men over the age of 21. The very same act also gave the vote to virtually all women over the age of 30, however there were some restrictions in addition to age. This situation only lasted for another 10 years, when the 1928 Representation of the People Equal Franchise Act granted universal suffrage to all women over the age of 21, putting them on equal terms with men. Suffrage wasn't the only gender-related issue that was changing at this time. The Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919 removed any disqualification on the grounds of sex or marriage from public positions or incorporated societies. Whilst not as comprehensive as the Sex Discrimination Act, this went a long way towards making sexual discrimination against women illegal. In 1920, the Married Women Maintenance Act was passed, which gave the courts the power to order fathers to make weekly payments of up to 10 shillings a week, or £23 in today's money, for each child up to the age of 16 in the mother's custody. We see here the beginning of modern child maintenance payments, now that the courts were being ever more favourable towards women when it came to granting custody. The tender years doctrine was being expanded by case law to include all children up to the age of 16, not just children under the age of 7. Increasingly, women were getting the children and men were getting the bill. Now that custody and maintenance were being granted to women on divorce, we see the major disadvantages of divorce being removed for women. Men's marital obligations continue beyond divorce, whilst all women's obligations, what little they were, end on separation. It comes then as perhaps no great surprise that we see the ever-decreasing restrictions on divorce. The Matrimonial Causes Act 1937 made divorce easier to access, particularly for women who until then could not divorce merely on the grounds of adultery, as men could. Women required additional offences to adultery, such as incest, sodomy or cruelty. Whilst this may be seen as equalising divorce laws, it should be remembered that female fidelity has always been part of the marital agreement in a way that male fidelity hasn't. It's worth noting at this time that there was somewhat of a schism within the feminist movement. Groups such as the 6 Point Group, founded in 1921, campaigned for what they claimed was strict equality between men and women, although their campaigns notably didn't include ending men's financial obligations towards women. Whilst other groups, such as the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship, wanted protectionist measures that applied to women only, such as preventing women from doing work that might be considered too dangerous, such as mining. The feminist movement was significantly less active, or certainly less successful, during the 30s, 40s and 50s. This is no doubt due to the distractions of the Great Depression and World War II, where again we see men being forced to fight on pain of imprisonment. At its peak, conscription in the UK applied to all men between the ages of 18 and 51 who were not already engaged in vital industries. Interestingly, conscription was also applied to women. Not to do anything particularly dangerous, of course, and the terms were somewhat different to men, with it only applying to women between 20 and 30, and not if they had children or were married. I guess it can be assumed that a married woman had a husband to do her work for her. The death toll from World War II was absolutely sickening, with 60 to 80 million people killed. As the civilian toll was much higher than previous wars, women suffered far more, particularly in Eastern Europe, where the most destructive battles raged. However, the vast majority of the dead were still men, which becomes particularly obvious in Germany and Russia when you see the large post-war gender imbalances in those countries. Even in the Holocaust, your odds of surviving were slightly better if you were female. After the post-war rebuilding, the movement really took off again in the 1960s. At this point we really see the emergence of the virulent misandric elements within mainstream feminism, including some of its leading thinkers. But let us first consider the legal impacts of the second wave of feminism. The Equal Pay Act of 1970 and the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975 made virtually all discrimination on the grounds of sex illegal, unless of course the work was too dangerous or demanding, such as mining, policing and serving in the military. In that case, it was still perfectly okay to discriminate by employing men only. Of course, religions also stayed exempt from this legislation. But then again, when we look through history, the only real periods of systemic misogyny we see are caused by dominant religions, such as the witch burning of 16th and 17th century Europe, or discrimination in modern-day Islamic countries. The Matrimonial Causes Act 1973 established the principle of transferring property for the benefit of the child. It also established the principle that courts were not allowed to distinguish between the contribution made by a wife for doing domestic work and the husband's financial contribution. This is despite the fact that being a housewife had long since ceased to be a full-time job, with women now having only 2 or 3 children and with an array of domestic appliances to help. The combination of these two principles made it perfectly acceptable for courts to transfer virtually all of the family's assets to the woman on divorce if they had children, and half the assets if they didn't, irrespective of the actual contributions made to the household. Astonishingly, things could still get worse for men, and they did so when the government passed the Children's Act of 1989. Whilst this act contained many important child protection measures, it also enshrined in law the principle of the best interests of the child. This doctrine effectively states that the best interests of the child are maintained by minimising disruption, and that one parent, almost always the mother, will be given custody whilst the other parent has effectively no rights. The court determines the specific arrangements through a residency order, but there is no specific need to include the interests of the father. This principle is in direct opposition to the principle of shared parenting, and it makes it perfectly okay for one parent, the father, to be removed almost totally from the child's life, despite a distinct lack of evidence to actually support the position that this is in the best interests of the child. It also contributes to the winner-takes-all effect of modern divorce law, which causes lengthy and expensive litigation. Of course, you could argue that men are being foolish to fight the laws, but then what else can you do when you face losing your children? The Children's Act also established family courts in the UK. What makes these courts unique is the secrecy within which they sit. This secrecy goes well beyond just requiring anonymity for the people involved, and actually makes the entire proceedings secret, including banning observers. A father could actually be found in contempt of court for simply telling his story about how unfairly he felt he was treated by the court. This is all supposedly done to protect the child, despite again a complete lack of evidence that this secrecy is needed to protect the child. After all, the worst thing for the child is surely that their parents are getting divorced, and that of course can't be kept secret. Which begs the question, what is the purpose of the secrecy except to protect the interest of lawyers making money out of a broken system, and to prevent criticism of the blatantly pro-female bias of the courts? Finally, in 1996, we see the Family Law Act, which introduces no-fault divorce. As divorce now frequently ruins a man's life, but has little effect on a woman's, we see that divorce is made easier and easier to obtain. It therefore comes as no surprise that women initiate 67% of divorces, and the men are much more likely to report regretting the divorce that they got. It is also unsurprising that divorce has become a significant risk factor in male suicides, whilst making virtually no difference to the female suicide risk. What is staggering is that even after all of this legislation advantaging women, that some feminists will still protest that we live in a systemically misogynistic society.